Welcome to Inside Infrastructure. I'm Adrian Dwyer from Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host Ilya Zak from series sponsor PwC Australia. Ilya, how you doing?
Well, Adrian, thanks for asking, but particularly so this week because I got to revel in my infrastructure nerdiness by giving the Sydney Metro Northwest a test run.
Right. So, it's a momentous occasion for Sydney and its public transport system, but I know you don't live or work at either end of that rail line. Why were you there?
Look, I don't live or work anywhere near it, but I'd like to think it was Inside Infrastructure's first field piece, although I guess I didn't really record anything either. But I did get to see the new bridge and SkyTrain sections, which all looked very fancy. And I'm mentioning those two specifically because I'm hoping to segue into our special guest for this episode.
Right, it's seamless. Thank you, Ilya. A great segue because our special guest for this episode is Avery Bang. She's the CEO of Bridges to Prosperity, a remarkable charity that constructs pedestrian footbridges in areas of the remote developing world. We had an excellent discussion with Avery a few weeks ago at PwC Sydney office, a few days after Avery delivered the Infrastructure Partnerships Australia annual oration. So without further ado, here's Avery. So Avery Bang, welcome to Inside Infrastructure. I guess as a first step, can you tell us what Bridges to Prosperity is and what you do?
Elevator pitch style.
Elevator pitch. All right, that's an easy one. Bridges to Prosperity is really focused on the rural last mile, so people that walk everywhere. And how do you physically connect them? So physically connect kids going to school, physically connect people going to markets and clinics through simple pedestrian footbridges. And I'm the president and CEO, so kind of chief dreamer, chief paper pusher, whatever you want to think about it that way.
So just footbridges, like just paint a picture for me. What sort of a footbridge are we talking about and where?
Absolutely. So footbridges that are, anywhere from about half a football field in length to 2 football fields in length, and only about 1 meter wide. So you're only walking, taking a bike, maybe a motorcycle.
Thanks for using metric there.
Yeah, just for you. And these are in remote corners of emerging frontier markets. So places like Rwanda, Uganda, Bolivia, that sort of place.
So these are across previously impassable
exactly
ravine or river or that kind of...
Well, it's kind of this cross-section where there's 2 types of communities that are the most isolated, that need the highest, amount of attention, and one have been isolated forever. And so there's this seasonality, and maybe with climate change, rivers are rising more unpredictably and with greater velocity. So that's one, communities that are becoming increasingly more isolated but have always been. And the other are communities that have tried to be connected. Let's say that they were with, someone had put a piece of cable across or had tried to build a bridge decades ago and it had since been broken. And so those communities are still trying to cross in whatever method or mechanism they were able, but no longer are able. So they're now blocked.
Yeah, okay. So I can see that this is a problem that people can't cross rivers, but could you just talk us a bit more through the problem you're trying to solve through Bridges to Prosperity?
Can I use your kids?
Yeah, go on.
All right, that's fair game.
Yeah, you go.
So Jack and Emily, they're both, let's just imagine they're twins instead of being 3 and 5. So 2 5-year-olds. And they are ostensibly going to start school. And so you want to send them, let's say you've got a lot of gender equity in your blood and you really care about educating your little girl and your little boy equally. Well, if the river's up to their, let's call it your knees in the morning, you probably would say, scamper on if you're going to come right back. But if you're going to send your little boy and your little girl to school and you're not sure if the river is going to rise tonight, if you're not clear that they're going to be able to make it home, I'd bet you anything that you and your wife would think differently about Jack going to school than Emily. Because Emily spending a night on the far side of a river would mean a very different thing than Jack. And for people around the world that live entirely in a walking existence, they walk everywhere. The ability to have that knowingness that, yes, I can come home tonight is the difference between going to school, going to a job, those sorts of things.
What's the size of the problem that you're solving? Has there been any evaluation of it?
Yeah, the World Bank has a, broad strokes 1 billion people put out there. So that's a 1 in 7 mark.
How's that defined?
The Rural Access Index is RAI is a radial distance of 2 miles from a capped road, year-round access.
Right.
And so that's certainly not 100% of those people are isolated because of a river.
Right.
So there's some cross-section of that. We estimate 10,000 communities globally One of their largest constraints is lack of access.
10,000 communities that you've identified would substantially, materially benefit from a pedestrian footbridge.
Yep.
And how many of those have already been gifted a bridge?
We are biting small, so we've only built 300 to date. But I think what's really exciting is that if you start to imagine as a nonprofit or a charity, you have to really figure out what you do and do that really well before you want to really start to scale in a meaningful way. But we're at that tipping point. So we've spent the last 15 years becoming really, really good at how do you design and build rural infrastructure, and how do you build that with local vulnerable populations that are not trained or skilled, and convert that into these last mile bridges.
Right.
So even though we've only built 300, we've actually taken on a contract here in the next 5 years to build another 350 just in Rwanda. So I think so often we are very congratulatory of our charitable work. We're like, oh, you hit this major milestone. You reached 1 million people.
Right.
And I had this slide where I had like million is, whatever your vertical axis, and it wasn't not a log frame. So it's like, 1 million people here. And my next slide was like, there's something like 500 million of the billion that are the ones that are isolated because of lack of a bridge.
Right.
And so you just give yourself a bit of a reality check that I think more people in the social sector need to be really thoughtful about how do we start to solve the problem as opposed to just have incremental increases in impact. And I think we're on the just starting edge.
So before we talk just about that, the bigger impact, let's start about the beginnings of Bridges to Prosperity. You can talk us through the history and how it came to be about and how you got involved.
Sure. So Bridges to Prosperity was founded in 2001 by a gentleman by the name of Ken France. And he, as his story goes, he's a much better storyteller, but you can imagine he's at the car getting, or the vehicle store getting his oil changed. So you're like meant to be sitting there for 30 minutes, an hour, what have you. And he takes a National Geographic, and he's just recently retired. So he's in his mid 40s, like he's done quite well. He's no longer needing to go make a paycheck. So he's sitting there waiting for his oil to get changed, and this National Geographic magazine just opens in his lap. And as he tells it, here's this photo of this multi-arched bridge that had been built in the 1400s by the Portuguese. And this little multi-arched bridge, as he's reading the story, has been self-destructed by the local community back in 1938 to stop the Italian invasion from coming across to Ethiopia. And so there's this fairly anecdotal story of this woman who is rafting the Blue Nile, comes across this old broken bridge, looks up and sees this crazy situation where there's essentially a string or a rope and several people on either side of this broken part of the bridge, and people are literally like pulling themselves across. And so she's like, well, that's a photo opportunity. Pulls off, takes a photo, makes it a National Geographic. And here's Ken sitting in, the tire shop, waiting for his oil to get changed. And it's like, I could do something about that. And so he, did what I think a lot of people don't have the courage to do, which was to actually put in motion going to find out the problem, putting together a group of people, trying to figure out how to put the money together. And actually, I think it was 2 years later, went and actually built something of a bridge there.
In that, where that picture was in National Geographic?
It's exactly over that bridge, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So he solved a very, very specific problem, and that was the start.
And I think what was really important about our founding story is that if you could kind of imagine, and maybe we could put this live on your website somewhere, is that if you can imagine this multi-arch span and something's broken, the most obvious solution is you take a truss and you put it over the gap. That's what he did. He just did a truss structure on the gap. But the reality of what he was promising was not a bridge. It was safe access. And so as a founding story, he didn't have the context at that time that actually you have to know what's happening with the government and what's happening with other investments. And so it actually, further upstream, there was a dam being put in. So less than 2 years later, this effectively tidal wave comes down, makes it so that truss bridge is now entirely underwater, and the bridge gets ripped away. Yeah. And so herein starts Ken's really existential crisis of, is this a bridge that we've promised, or is this access? And if not for a simple truss bridge right over this gap, the next best option is you actually look up the ravine in either direction. Kind of think about Indiana Jones. You cover, if you want to cross a big gorge, you've got to be able to get cables across that whole thing. So he started this is way above his pay grade, if you will. and got this idea that he could start raising money with groups like Rotary and go build bridges. But that particular span was much too long to take on first. Yeah. And I can get to that later. I can babble. But eventually we were able to go back and build this 100 meter, as long as a football field length bridge to connect those people again.
So you have given away a couple of times in what you've said there. You mentioned a truss bridge and some other things, and I fear there might be an engineer lurking.
Oh no, that's embarrassing.
So you're an engineer by background?
I'm trained as a civil structural engineer, and I worked in consulting for a little while, but it's actually my dad's fault. So to be real clear, don't care if you're trained in it or not. My dad would take us on a family holiday. We'd pack in. We're middle America. Everyone road trips everywhere. So it's my little brother and I, my lovely mom, and we've got all these bags and our dog squeezed between us. And then we'd pull up to this middle of nowhere bridge abutment and pull off. And here we go, toiling down the side of the hill. And we'd be looking up, and that was the not the stop on the way, but that was the pinnacle of the journey. And so it was so embedded in my blood that you start to appreciate the built environment around you, and that these roads and bridges did not just exist; they were products of a passion and a purpose for many, many people. And so I did go into engineering school and was able to, kind of use some of my dad's passion towards my career.
Both genetically predestined to be an engineer and a trained engineer, and then Bridges to Prosperity. How did you go from being a consulting engineer to doing this?
Because there's plenty of bridges to build in the US.
Yeah.
You've chosen to build them somewhere else. What's the driving force there?
I was living in Fiji at the time, and I actually was kind of having one of those, I think there should be something as a quarter life crisis. You're not yet old enough to really know what the heck you want to do, but you're pretty sure you want to do something of purpose. And, I was sitting there being my math and my science are going well, but physics and differential equations and all this engineering stuff isn't necessarily that challenging per se, but really unfulfilling.
Speak for yourself.
It's pretty challenging.
I mean, challenging, but right, it's not rocket science. It's just to get through it.
I find simple arithmetic difficult.
I mean, fair. Yeah, for me, the math wasn't the challenging part. It was finding a sense of why. And here I am in these classrooms and toiling away and not sleeping just to study and all these things. And I'm for what? So I can be a number crunching monkey somewhere? That seems so soulless. And I'm
taking that personally.
I know. Sorry, I'm probably offending all of your listeners here.
We are at PwC here. Yeah, there's a few number crunching monkeys around.
I know. I actually love my calculator. It's still sleep by my bed. But I think in general at that age, it was it felt really big. It felt like I am going to graduate and do what? And there was just such a deep seeking component to where I was at that point. So I was maybe I could go and study abroad or live somewhere else and, find my way. And I had I lost one of my favorite aunts to breast cancer that summer and had this kind of, well, maybe I should go into healthcare, of all the wonderful people in the world and all of the greatness that can come of the human existence. There's still so much unknown about how we can, have the quality of life improved and also, durability of one's life. Maybe I'll go into healthcare. And so, I showed up in Fiji and, in hindsight, I know how ignorant and naive this was, but I remember going down to the Breast Cancer Foundation and I'm 20. I'm hi, what can I do to help? And nothing. And pretty much you're going to be probably unhelpful. But they put me into a little team of people that would go out and effectively just do discussions of why early breast cancer detection was important, because at that time there was only one mammogram machine on the entire, any of the islands. So you're having stage 4 is your average diagnosis for someone coming in to actually get evaluated. And as we're going out and doing this little group of people to go and to teach about the importance of early detection, our ability to actually get to the communities was highly constrained by the physical environment around us. So I come from middle America where, we don't have a lot of wealth, but I also was not able to, I was never constrained in my ability to go to school or go to a hospital or go to a market because I didn't have a road. And so in Fiji, it was so fascinating that our ability to reach these populations to be able to just do something so simple as have a conversation about preventative health was based on the lack of infrastructure or something there. And so I remember coming across a pedestrian footbridge during one of these little visits. And there are these kids running across towards me at the same time that I'm meant to be walking across to go speak with these women. And it was just one of those like, that's not that challenging. Like, it is, but not. A bridge is actually quite simple, and it's an equalizer.
It's interesting that you mention it in that context, because one of the questions we wanted to ask was, why bridges? Because there's any number of services that these places are going to need, and I guess so. You're saying it's not so much that they need the bridge; it's that the bridge is the enabler of those other services. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Fair statement?
I mean, I think it's quite frustrating actually, because now that you've seen something and you see the root cause of poverty is actually lack of access.
Right.
The inefficiencies of doing it in the reverse are crazy. So like you do 2 water holes and 2 schools and 2 clinics, or you could just be like, wow, maybe we should connect these 2 bits first.
So have you had any chance to evaluate just how much these bridges are enabling delivery of those other services?
Yeah, it's a super good question. We worked with the University of Notre Dame and Yale to evaluate what the attribution of impact due to a footbridge. And so what they were able to look at over the course of about a 3.5-year study period was to look at communities with a bridge in comparison to those without, and particularly around economics. So household level income, there was profound differences with people who had access. And what they found was like 2 different parts of increased income. One is if you have access, you're more likely to go to labor. So you can go get day wages, get paid, these things. But the second is as a farmer, which many, many people who live in the walking world are smallholder farmers. These farmers were able to take risks that were just not available to them when they didn't have infrastructure. So what the researchers found was that when controlling for all of the other variables, bridges made possible for farmers to take on risks like buying more seeds, buying more fertilizer, planting more of their land if they had more. They also no longer, as a farmer, had to store surplus to be able to absorb essentially a shock event like a river rising. And so you take all of those things together, and this surplus production, higher yields, higher volume of production, and you're able to get 75% increase in in farmer profitability. So labor market increase as well as farmer profitability, and household incomes are going up over 30% just based on a bridge.
So with the farm, that's just certainty of access to the market.
You got it.
Yeah, so they just know that they'll be able to get, if they can cultivate the land, grow the seeds, harvest them, they will be able to get to market.
Exactly. Because you think about it, like if you're living day by day, literally, but a season can either sink your entire family or incrementally improve your status. Like you don't have the same buffer. Like the financial buffer that we all exist with is just not available to people in the very bottom billion. And so to have a bad crop, or worse yet, to have spoilage. So you already paid the money. You've had all of your, there goes all of your income into the seeds and the fertilizers. And then you're isolated and you're stuck on the far side of a river, and your production starts to spoil and it continues to spoil. Well, you're never going to see that money again. And so a farmer has to be so calculated on how much risk she is willing to take. And so if you know that you can go, it's just that knowingness, like that changes our risk behavior in a pretty profound way.
I'm conscious that a lot of the examples you give, they're very specific examples to, one family, one farmer. Do you have a sense of how many farmers or how many families are served by an individual bridge? Or is there like a minimum requirement that you have to justify going in and putting in a bridge in a certain place?
Are you familiar with Sarah Palin?
I have, yes, very much so.
Okay, so in the American context, I get asked this like a bridge to nowhere.
Yeah.
Google search it. It's a very funny situation over there. But we are very conscious of how do we go about selecting where and why.
Right.
We work with governments to build infrastructure, and sometimes it could be perceived as a political or politically motivated investment. But I think what's really important is as we select where, there's both technical criteria. So certainly could build a bridge that's several miles across, but that would be an inefficient use of resource. And you certainly could also build something that's maybe 10 feet wide, but also just throw a log across it, right? But more critically into your question is that there's a sweet spot where you could build in an urban environment and have tens and tens of thousands of people crossing a bridge every day. But the incremental difference for them, if you think about the amplitude of that change for their livelihood, is maybe quite a bit smaller than a rural environment where you could have just several hundred.
That's how we measure them here. We measure them in terms of minutes saved per person, but it's still, someone might save 10 minutes, 20 minutes from an enormous bridge. And I'm guessing for the bridges that you're building, it's days, but maybe not 1 million people going across, but like you said, 100. But where do you draw the line that 100 people saving 10 days, do those two factors add up to a bridge to prosperity?
Yeah, we actually call it an isolation index, which is really an internal framework through we decide if it's a go, no go, at least to be able to go forward with the government or our public sector partner. And I think what's challenging is that isolation index is really unique per country. So great examples in Bolivia, you'll very rarely find farming communities more than 500-600 people. Like that's a fairly median sized community. In Rwanda, it'd be really uncommon to work in a community less than 2,000. Right. And so we just have made the decision that if we elect to work with the government and to be involved with a partner of that level, population density is really specific to that particular program. So we don't actually compare across countries once you're in it. That said, we obviously look at our unit costs. So like even we think about dollar per person served at the more macro level. But more nuanced is like, how much does it cost us to create access to a water point? Or how much does it cost us to create access to any number of the services? And I think, most of the sustainable development goals are also actually around a metric unit of time. So safe water access is defined by a measure of time of walking to that thing. And so I think to your questions, there's lots of good social services and a lot of great charities. But we believe that if you can first connect all the goods and services that are there, and then be able to be that framework and that foundation upon which all other, both social and infrastructure and otherwise, can be built upon on top, it's a much more efficient way to do it.
So have you got a follow-up question, Ilya, or can I?
Oh, no, go nuts.
Yeah, so you've made a decision. There's a government you can work with. There's the willingness to do it. You've raised the money. You've decided a bridge is going to go here. Just talk us through the engineering. What are these? How do you make them? How do you do them efficiently? Open question.
Yeah. This is going to be the nerdy part of Avery coming out. Is that all right?
No, that's fine. We're accepting of everyone here.
Okay. I don't feel judged. That's actually what I wrote my master's thesis on in engineering school, was how could we standardize this infrastructure in a way that could just be, I don't mean to be so blasé, but a red bridge, a blue bridge, a green bridge. And you literally go into a tabular function and say, what's the height difference between the two sides? And also what's the distance across or span? And based on those two variables, put it into, it's going to be the red bridge on the right side, and it's going to be the blue abutment on the left side. And here's all your bill of materials. Here's your quantities, poof. And I think for a long time, I really thought that the challenge was a technical one. You kind of get this sense of if people just knew how simple this was, you could just create the standard, make the manual, and then voila, you hand it off and then it happens. And I remember having this kind of, I want to say I was with the organization 6-7 years, and the uptick just wasn't happening. I was like, we're getting really good at how do you just standardize design these things, how to train local engineers, how to survey, how to train local folks to build them. But the volume of work was fairly flat, and it took a lot of soul searching. Is it the technology itself is not right? Is people don't actually want footbridges? What is going on here? And I think what came out of that other side is our team found out that it really was not a technical problem, but a capital mobilization one. And so the size of the asset, if you want to think of a bridge like an asset, was too small for a federal central government to get involved. We're talking less than 100,000 US. These are quite tiny on the scale of a national government, even in Rwanda. And yet, if you think about a district or state government, again, we'll just use Rwanda as an example, that is quite big. If you think about they need to be building 30, 50, 100 of these things. And then we're talking about timescales where we can't wait 100 years to build simple pedestrian infrastructure. You're going to miss the opportunity here. So there's a time urgency to it. So here's the district governments. They are not bondable. No one is these district governments are not going into the market and borrowing money.
But they're aware of the problem?
They're definitely aware of the problem.
They're aware that these particular sites would benefit from some kind of intervention?
That's the way that we procure sites, is actually through kind of almost like a call center, where we were working with our public sector partner, not to ask who wants a bridge, because everyone will throw their hand up and say me, just like, free handouts, right? But it's more of a constraints analysis. Where are people currently not having year-round access? Maybe it's to school, maybe it's healthcare. Where are markets having, differences in attendance? And aggregating that up. And so the government ends up taking us to all of the places where they've identified high need sites. So it's actually the district level government in the Rwandan context is called sectors and cells. So all the cell and sector leaders are the ones that have requested this infrastructure. And by the time you get to the state government, they're well aware that they are having anywhere from 30 to 300, places that have been requested. And maybe 25% of those are in that sweet spot of high impact and technically feasible.
And you just pick them off one by one, kind of whatever's the most benefit versus cost, whatever comes out with the best ratio, or is there some other programming mechanism that you use to decide which ones you build?
Yes, that's actually kind of the shift that we're going through right now. Is we used to just do one by one. What's the highest project? How many can you afford to put in your budget this year? Rinse, repeat, do it again. And going back to the time urgency, we're not going to solve this problem in Rwanda in the next 100 years, let alone globally. And that's crazy. This is not hard. And so we went back to the drawing board and actually said, well, what if we were to aggregate and put all of these rural projects across not only one district, but all of the districts into a single portfolio? And that portfolio of work, then instead of being 100,000 US per bridge, you're looking at hundreds of bridges, and the transaction size in this case was $28 million. So $28 million is a number that a central government in the Rwandan context can respond to.
What's $28 million paying for, by the way? So what are we paying? Is that local labor? Is that your time? Is that what does it go towards?
Yeah, we'll be building 355 bridges by the end of 2024, which is in alignment with Rwanda's national strategy for transformation. And so what that full budget cost includes is the whole suite, from local labor, local transport, local engineering, superintendents.
How does that break down, if vaguely?
Yeah. So we're really proud to announce that the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Infrastructure, Ministry of Local Planning, and the Rwandan Transportation Development Authority, and us, Bridges to Prosperity, have come together to split that cost. So in total, $28 million. The government of Rwanda's consortium part is roughly 40% of that. And they're paying for all the direct materials that are local, all of the local labor, all the local transport. They're also helping to pay for the importation of the materials that we get donated. We, on the other hand, are covering things like capacity building, training, construction oversight, quality control, safety, salaries.
It's an interesting point, because there's a big issue often in charitable work that involves construction, where they end up often taking local jobs. And it sounds like you have identified what's missing and are only trying to add that. Is that fair to say?
I'm sure there's a lot of other things that are missing, but in this particular subset, I have no business of taking a job from a local person who could easily carry rocks and dig holes,
exactly,
like the next guy. So they're all being paid, and they're all from the local, which is kind of a cool model if you think about it. The people who are going to use that bridge every day are the ones that build it.
Right.
The tier of folks that are the superintendents and really need to uphold that duty of care and that safety bar are coming from a regional area, but they too are Rwandese and have gone through like a 2-year vocational program.
Yours?
Nope, usually through a local. We hire out of places like Kigali Institute of Science and Technology, a host of different vocational and institutional places of higher education in Rwanda.
Right.
But I am not trying to fly in here with a bunch of Australians or let alone Americans to take people's jobs. The ways that we engage,
We're very expensive.
you guys are really bloody expensive. I'll tell you. But like the way that we try to get the foreign nationals involved is how do we model things that are hard to find talent locally. So things like if we're going to have a really long or more complex structure, and we need to have a new construction method where maybe, just for example, you can imagine these towers are 10 meters and they're laying flat and they need to be erected to vertical. Like that's something you don't really want a bunch of folks who don't have experience in guying off towers to do for the first time. Yeah. You bring in a team from a company like a Balfour Beatty or an Arup who can help design and build something like that and train our team how to do that more effectively and efficiently. But critically, 80% of the infrastructure we're building has no foreign nationals that ever touch it.
Right.
So I mean this question in the most respectful way, and I respect you, but it strikes me that you're applying commercial capitalist principles to solve this problem, and I like that. This is my kind of perception maybe of some of the aid world is just people that really want to solve problems and help, but maybe don't have that commercial lens or focus on it. Is that your kind of?
It's such a compliment. I should pay you more.
So, but is that your kind of? Is that what you bring to it personally? That commercial lens?
I mean, I think at my root, I'm really driven by the sense that if you can have a win-win, a lot more will get done. So if I'm just a charity that's constantly asking and taking, our potential impact is going to be so limited. I think that's a large reason why I went back to business school. Was I had this felt sense that, as trained as an engineer, I've got all the technical chops it takes, but I was being left out of a conversation about really what's happening and why is there not more money coming to this problem of rural isolation. And, there's a number of different stakeholders that all could have a win-win. So thinking about the public sector, it hadn't occurred to me that it's not that there's not the political will, it's just the transaction size was too small. So there's too much friction, if you think of it this way, in the system to be able to get out to actually contract with all of these individual contracts. So it wasn't that there was a lack of wanting. It was just a lack of capital principles that I was lacking for me. And I think equally for the way that we engage the private sector here in Australia and elsewhere is that if I'm going to come up and be like, Adrian, can you just give us a check every year? Eventually you're going to tire of me. But if I come and say, well, there's actually this win-win. You help me build the capacities and skills in a very specific part of my program. And in exchange, you're going to be able to spend 10 people into Rwanda for 10 days. And those 10 people are going to be able to be part of your ethos of your company, whether you're using that recruiting or, in your marketing. There's a lot of use cases for it. And so I think what's really unique about Bridges to Prosperity is we're trying to figure out how do you win-wins all over the place. Like even I'll use another example is procurement. One might say how boring. You're talking about how do you get steel cable into the country? Well, if you think about long span cable bridges, the most costly and most expensive material is this cable. And so the win-win that we were able to figure out was port authorities, like here I can actually see over my shoulder, is that if you bring a container ship to a port and you need to get a container off of the ship and back on land or conversely back onto the ship, it's just a pulley system. And those cables end up having to be scrapped. So there's some commercial value to that. Let's call it, a couple dollars per metric ton of whatever the steel pricing is. I have no idea. But if I have to go buy that material, we're talking about $10 a linear meter upwards in the markets where I'm trying to import. So if I can get that cable that otherwise is totally fine, you cut it at the places where the pulleys have been touching it has fray, you load test it, re-spool it, put it on containers, have the government import it, then it's a win-win because then there's a good story and also a tax receipt for the port for donating cable. And in exchange, we have a much reduced capital expenditure for our projects.
So that's something that you have to, there's no unique insight that you have into these countries that they would you'd have to do a lot of research to go and identify those opportunities. Why not just give it to some local construction company, for example? Why are they not able? They'd have the supply chain sorted out. They'd know where they're getting their steel. I'm assuming they'd be working on much bigger projects. Are you helping them, or are you just coordinating on the ground, or are you kind of replacing what they would be doing otherwise?
Well, I mean, our big vision is we're creating little construction companies in markets where they aren't currently. So if you think about, I'm not talking about Kigali, I'm out in Rilindo, or I'm out in Guerrero. There are not construction companies that I'm undermining in the way that you and I would think about,
There's no one building anything out there.
Market competition. There's NGOs and there's governments doing really great work around things like healthcare centers or schools.
Yeah.
But what we think we're kind of uniquely positioned to do is to create a portfolio of work that's across a huge region. So maybe the World Bank could contract on a big education program and could have 100 schools. That's super reasonable. The way they procure that and they would contract that would eventually get local construction folks involved, for sure. But I think what we're trying to do is to say that in a lot of these areas where it's nationwide, you can create what's called build teams. And so our kind of unit of production, if you think of it this way, are 3 or 4 tiers up, but everything from contracts, procurement, safety, quality, operations, and that's all self-contained within these units. So I can build 24 bridges per year per unit. And so when you start to think about, there's no reason that those build teams couldn't build other infrastructure. They could build social infrastructure like schools or hospitals or clinics, but we are just building that kind of backbone of how do you get all the resources in place and build these little companies to do that.
So you leave these construction companies as an ongoing entity after you're done in the area?
That's our hope in the Rwandan context.
Okay.
Yeah.
But with a 5-year program in Rwanda, there's jobs to move people to. So
It's a huge employment. Just like, if you think about, like, I can use the United States as an example. Infrastructure investments are a huge coup for the economy, not only because they make the connection more efficient, but also it's a huge employment scheme. And so it's the same thing here, is that we're employing a huge cross-section of Rwandese to make this program possible. And at the other end, it's not like people are all of a sudden like skillless. And ideally, the way we've structured it is that they're not highly dependent on this foreign aid organization to continue employing them. But we think it's actually year 3 to 4 when we really build out the how do you transition build teams into could they contract on their own.
It's related to another very common problem in a lot of foreign aid, is that it's surprisingly easy to get capital for the delivery of a solar panel or a battery or something else. Making sure that it keeps working for 30 years, though, is often challenging. And I can't remember the charity, but there was some remote island that had a whole bunch of solar panels installed, and after a year or so they stopped working, so they just chucked them in the water. And not their fault. They weren't taught how to maintain it, and it's quite a skilled process. Do you have some kind of way of ensuring that A, the bridges are maintained, and B, the locals know how to do it without your ongoing presence?
Yeah, it's super. I think that's one of the biggest challenges in the sector, is like, how do you have ongoing operation and maintenance, make sure that your investment has a lifespan that you intend. And I think what's really uniquely helpful for bridges, different than water, and certainly different than solar, is that a water pump has, just think about how many little pieces can go wrong, and infinitely more for solar. So I don't wish to be in those sectors. I think for figuring out how to have locally maintained infrastructure when you have very complicated assets is a challenge that has not been cracked yet, to be honest. I think with footbridges, the idea is that you create such a durable asset that you have really low maintenance requirements. Like in the Rwandan context, 100% of our bridge decks went to steel. So if you can think about the option of having like a timber deck, which has let's call it 10-year lifespan, even if you do the full life cycle cost of, replacing a deck every even 7 years and call the lifespan of the structure 30, which is kind of our engineering mark. The reality is places like rural Rwanda, it's very challenging to replace a deck. So even if you calculate all the time and all the bits as well as materials, it's much better to over-design and to remove the critical path of maintenance. So we've done that. So as much as we've been able is you remove maintenance from the necessary daily. The second part is we do spend a tremendous amount of resource and time training the local community and how do you do annual maintenance. Here's the checklist. The bridge committee that is created both for building as well as ownership are the ones that are left with here's a how-to and here's the checkpoints and everything's, photos and little graphics.
Do they get paid?
And they do get paid.
For over the 30 years?
Over the 30 years, it depends. So like most of the operation and maintenance costs, O&M is actually baked into the contract with the district.
Right.
So that's the third part. So the third part is that we have an inspection program. So we have a 1-year warranty period where we'll come in and we'll say, here's the handoff of the asset, goes to the public sector. And up to 1 year, if anything defaults, then we are 100% on the line for that. But that starts and initiates an inspection program that continues. So you go back biannually and you go and you say, oh, well, it actually looks like, I don't know, the U-bolts are unraveling and you're having a loose deck panel.
We know what those are, don't we?
Across the engineering.
Yeah. Well, there's some sort of deck panel that's, lifting up and making
Please dumb it down for us.
Sorry. Just imagine that the deck starts
hammer and nail. That's as far as we go.
The nail starts to remove itself from the timber. And now it becomes more obvious. There's things like that where in the first year, a lot of the really trivial things are things that will come up in the first year. So you have an opportunity to engage with the community again and say, well, here's how we maintain that. Remember, this is how you do it. But much more challenging is longer term. So when, let's say 8 years out, we see the deck needs to be replaced and hey, it's contractually in the owner's contract to replace that. It would be one thing for me to just say, no problem, let me take care of that for you. It'd actually be very efficient for me to do that. Much more challenging in what we take on is effectively saying there is a problem that needs to be addressed and this needs to get into the public sector's budget next year.
Right.
So if you did not accrue that balance of that O&M as we had talked about it and it's in your contract, this needs to be replaced and have essentially the local staff that are advocating. And part of the cool thing about doing a nationwide program is our willingness to engage with the district. If you aren't fulfilling on your past contracts, we're super able to just take a step back and say, well, if you're not, doing asset management with your current projects, why should we continue building with you? But it's complicated. Just
one more question on it, Adrian. So how's it been going? You've built, you said 300 or so. Are they all still standing? Yeah.
So we've got 302 projects completed. Gotta be careful. Here's me knocking on some wood. We've never had a bridge failure, with the exception of that original project I mentioned earlier with Ken. But we've had to spend a lot of money and resource on inspection, maintenance, and in some cases we actually had to totally scrap a project and rebuild. So like in the example of that last, scrape and rebuild, it was in Haiti. We had a hurricane come through in the Grand Anse region, and it's 10-foot swells and nothing I can assure you that an engineer is designing for in terms of wind gusts and wave height. We had 5 projects in the region. 4 of them were serviceable within a week when we sent in our recon crew. Or actually, I think we had to do a little bit more, but they were safely crossable several weeks later. The 5th bridge, the river entirely meandered. And so at that point, it's not really the fault of the community or the district. That's a poor placement, whether or not we made the decision correctly based on the information we had. So we actually went back to, we were partnering with CARE on that. And funded through the UK aid DFID. And we were like, we're going to take this on whether or not you guys support us, but we feel like we have the moral, ethical obligation to replace this entire bridge. And they stepped up and helped make that financially possible. So, there was 2 years out of service, but we were able to rebuild it.
The bridges that leaving aside any sort of natural disasters, they're standing, they're actively used, you're still following up on them occasionally, and you can see that it's these are all fantastic investments as expected.
Well, I think our I think our inspection team and our maintenance team are quite proud of the durability, but the interesting thing for us is that we have a feedback loop, which is unique to when you do one thing and do it well, is that when you start to have hundreds of things that are the same, you can start to see early days like, oh, well, that, I'm just going to make up an example. Let's just say the way that we connected the cable, that wasn't working. You can see it a couple of times over, you change your entire design process. So by the time you have now it's like actually over 15 years of building one type of thing over and over. The actual bridge itself is pretty durable and upstands really high levels of like durability testing, if you think of it this way.
How much of a problem is corruption?
Ooh, in what way?
Well, in no, without reference to any particular country, do you find you're able to cut through the challenges that come with kind of local governments and local power and the potential for the money that's relatively small amounts of money you're being put in being diverted to other things that aren't building bridges?
That's a super good question. I mean, I think the reality is that in many of the places where we work, there is some level of political corruption. I like to think almost every government has corruption. It's just how legitimized is it or not. And so I think in the frontier emerging markets, most of Africa, Haiti, Latin America, you've got to be really cautious how money flows. So I think that that's the biggest risk mitigation strategy that we have, is that as opposed to, let's just call you Mr. Mayor Adrian, if I have a contract with you, which I'm meant to be having my donors funding money to you and I get paid entirely through a contract with you, that's a different opportunity for skim than if you are paying this particular thing directly. So let's say that you're paying for transport and local labor, fill in the blank, and I'll cover my part. And so I think as you get bigger and you're procuring with like a World Bank or the bilaterals, things get more complicated, obviously. So like we've contracted with World Bank in Haiti, and you end up having to work with like essentially through subcontracts that they already have a contract, like a standing contract with the bank or the government. But it's not inconsequential kinds of potential for your staff to just say, oh, well, it's fine. This will be easy. This will be easy. And so the amount of time we spend talking about how do you make sure that you're not getting sucked into corrupt practices, or you're not under such tremendous time pressure that you have no option but to oblige that, I think is really key.
That's an interesting point though, because that runs foul of a whole bunch of US and Australian laws that you might, if you're aware of the corruption, then you might not be allowed to participate in it as a US entity.
Absolutely. So I think it's like really important that like how we contractually engage with the government. So if they're like, we can't clear anything, a really good example, we can't clear cable because you're last in queue. Okay, that could be exactly what's happening. That could also be an invitation for a bribe. Who knows? Genuinely. So if your project cannot proceed without that cable, there's a couple ways you can address that. One is that you go and you advocate really hard and you're like trying to beat the door down, and then you're like actually being asked for a bribe. Or two, you end up having to stockpile. So you're so far ahead of your supply chain and your inventory is essentially a warehouse storage. Like I have so much cable ahead of projects that I'm not going to be stuck having to pay a bribe or having to sit there. I don't care if you keep my cable. Like we had our cables in one particular unnamed country in their clearing customs for almost 2 years. Happily, because I already had cable. It's coming. It'll come eventually. But I think you got to be really careful. And if staff do feel like they're being put in a position that is corruptible, it's like having a whistleblower and a chain of command that comes all the way to the top. So that way it's elevated.
So I think that's a really interesting point, because there's a values call there where you said we'll bear the extra cost on storage.
Yep.
And that might be greater than the cost of the going bribe to solve a problem.
Which is the value proposition of the bribe.
Right.
Sure.
Right.
But you're making a values-based decision that, no, we're not going to engage in that. And we'll wear a little bit extra cost elsewhere to...
It's a lot of more cost. And it goes back to the same thing as maintenance and inspection. It's like, it'd be a lot more efficient just to, left, right, do whatever you need to do to get it done. But if you have like a basic principle that you believe that the local public sector should be the owner and you're fairly patient, this is a big reason why we have, at any given time, maybe 3 to 1 projects in queue that like we could take or leave, which is like a fairly agile work environment. Like we are not committed a year out on exactly what projects we're on. We just have crews scheduled out in their kind of, if you can imagine, their full Gantt chart and schedule, but they're not committed to that one particular project because if any number of things come up, it's like, fine, no rush, we'll go somewhere else. And that's taken 15 years to really figure out how to do in a way that don't put your staff in a deeply compromising position.
It's not just staff. I mean, you'd end up losing donors. And
I could lose my job. I could be in
exactly.
jail for sure. It's not a thing to take lightly.
So we've spoken about what Bridges to Prosperity's done, the incredible vision to solve the last mile, rural pedestrian last mile in Rwanda. And that's the next 5 years. What's the big vision? Solve this problem globally?
I think it's a problem we can solve, and we can solve it in our lifetime. But it's essentially like if we can prove the impact of networked connection in a whole country, and start to see not only the deep benefits to the individual, to the house, to the community, but that starts to translate also to a region and better yet a nation. I believe that this will become one of the preferred aid mechanisms. So as right now you could think about central governments, bilateral agencies, the bank, how they're putting capital into infrastructure works. It's largely power, which is great. If it's in transport, it's usually in vehicular access. I think this could become another pillar of those investments, but as opposed to being central urban infrastructure, we're starting to talk about aggregating rural assets into portfolios that could be investable at scale. So I think we can start to solve the problem of last mile isolation across the continent, and I think globally as well.
There's something that I think you've mentioned at a previous event that about potentially, and it sounds ghastly potentially, but maybe tolling these bridges. And I mention it because there's an interesting overlap with, you mentioned earlier, water, an interesting overlap with microtransactions that people in these countries have access to because of their mobile phones, that some water infrastructure that's delivered by charitable organizations is able to be maintained because people pay for it with, tiny transactions. Is that something that you've considered for one of your bridges?
It's an area of deep personal interest. I think there's so much behavior change difference between a public good and a public good that ends up being utilized at an individual level. So whereas I think your point is something like a water utility, your tap can be on and off, or you can get your jug filled or not. That's a very much an individual benefit that I think behavior around that has been proven. There's some great research coming out of Oxford on this, and a willingness to pay around rural water, and rural water works when serviceability changes. So if you can start to see people will pay more if you have better maintenance, that's very interesting, innovative work. However, the public good is to the personal benefit, whereas in the transportation infrastructure, I think it's the same reason you get a lot of pushback publicly for PPPs and all sorts of, road environments, is people believe that they should just be able to go and have free access. But critically for us, if you go back to what I was saying earlier about the benefit for a farmer is not actually needing to go across, but the opportunity to. So as we did a couple internal studies about it, it was, as a farmer, you'd only have to pay to go over when it was really severe, the once in, whatever number of times. And so there's two ways you could do that. One is that you price it equivalently. So it ends up having a spike, almost like your Uber surcharge. So it's raining, we're going to surcharge the heck out of you because we know you're going to use it right now. But you otherwise could walk through the river probably 80% of the time, which is totally great. That is our niche spot. But if you kind of do the financial modeling on that and your willingness to pay in a way that won't change behavior so people stop using the asset, our belief is that it ends up being such a long horizon of return compared to the actual local economic benefit that we haven't actually engaged more deeply in the intellectual activity.
Right.
That make sense?
Is anyone competing with you? Is there anyone else doing what you do?
There are a few other organizations that do footbridges. The most important and large one is Helvetas. They're based out of Switzerland, and I actually sit on their U.S. board, and they are...
So you partner with the other... Okay.
Yeah, and Helvetas is the most reputable, one of the most reputable organizations in the world across the water, sanitation, behavior change, women's education. They happen to do footbridges as a small but significant part of their work. They've done over 4,500 bridges in Nepal alone. So they are really quite good at this work. There's
You really need footbridges in Nepal.
Oh gosh,
across the
don't they?
mountains.
Don't they? There's a few other, there's a few groups that are missionaries that we've helped with. There's a really fantastic group called Engineers in Action, who we actually spun off all of the student engagement that we do, because we realized we're never going to be best at class at taking uni students, but we are best in class at bridges. So now if a student group, let's say, University of Melbourne wants to build a bridge, we'd send them to Engineers in Action, and then all the technical support and supply chain support that they need and we can help with, we go directly to the organization. So that way students can get this really great experience while we focus on what we're best in class at.
So there's no chance that you're going to build a bridge and 10 meters down the river, Helvetas, was that it?
Yeah,
is going to be building one simultaneously. You guys are coordinated. You're not overlapping with each other in any way.
We don't see it as a zero-sum game. So the more we can collaborate and we can actually be in coordination with other charities, the better.
Yeah.
We don't actually currently work in footbridges in the same countries as anyone else. So most of these other organizations are elsewhere in the world. But it's really important to have the ground game. Like if you don't know what the context is, I think that's translatable anywhere. If you think you're like the only one doing anything, you're going to get your butt, in the wrong spot pretty quickly. So we take ground truthing and,
it's a family
show. Yeah, totally.
I imagine there's a whole bunch of corporate Australia that would like to be involved in some way in Bridges to Prosperity. And I saw on the website you've got, I think, WSP, Bechtel, and lots of engineering firms involved already. What are the opportunities for more involvement? I mean, in this building, there's any number of people that would like to be involved, and I know actually PwC very much supports that kind of thing. What kind of things are you looking for? What are the opportunities, and where are they?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I appreciate that.
Oh, it's a plug, I guess, but it's
it's helpful.
It's self-serving as well. We people all over Australia, professionals are interested in doing work that actually maximizes the value of their skill set.
Yeah, well, I think there's kind of two pathways, so to speak, and one is at the individual level. A big part of our big push in Rwanda, as you heard, is the government's willing to put in a huge amount of money, and I have to go fundraise the other part. So that's being parsed out between individuals and also companies. And so getting individually involved is something we're actually seeking to broaden our base of support here in Australia. So whether it's getting involved with, charitable giving out of your paycheck, or whether it's like getting involved at a higher level, all things are really helpful. And I think probably more relevant to some of the corporate angle or industry angle is that we have a program of engaging corporate social responsibility. So I think it's super relevant as you think about how to get this next generation of young people enthusiastic about being aligned with their careers and their workplace, and with that workplace doing something bigger and for more than just their bottom line. We do what's an exchange program. So 10 people for 10 days have an opportunity to go and work with us and do a skills build with our team. So again, how do we build that culture of safety? How do we be able to innovate and do interesting work and teach our local staff? That exchange program is quite popular. So I think you mentioned WSP and Bechtel and Arup, a few others here in Australia, and a few dozen others around the world spend time with us and really build our capacity. And meanwhile, underwrite philanthropically a big part of our budget. So in either case, I'd love to have a chance to chat and maybe come back.
We'll when we put up this podcast and all our links, we'll put links to Bridges to Prosperity and make sure there's opportunity for people to engage with you on that, and we'll keep inviting you back as well.
Thanks, Adrian.
Before you go, we've had a tradition of asking everybody that comes on our podcast one question. I feel like I know what the answer is, but I'm going to ask anyway. What's your favorite type of infrastructure and why?
A favorite type of infrastructure is like easy one, obviously bridges. I think they're beautiful. I think they are the cross section of form following function, and I think that can be really just so graceful when done well. And I think that there's something obvious in my line of work, but even in the greater body of all infrastructure assets, I think there's something so signature where people see the ingenuity of, wow, that took a lot of smart people to pull off in a way that can sometimes be masked in the underground or even in the vertical world. So bridges for sure.
Thank you, Avery, for taking us through the story of Bridges to Prosperity and your own story about how you became the CEO. And thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Avery.
So that was Avery Bang, the CEO of Bridges to Prosperity. Ilya, what do you think?
I thought she was excellent. Absolutely excellent. And particularly so because of the way she's found a path for infrastructure professionals to do charitable work that actually gets the greatest value out of them, while also employing locals wherever possible. It's a unique balance, and I know that at PwC here, the executive team is very supportive of staff doing this kind of work. We can even put it in our timesheets, but it's sometimes very hard to find an actually skilled outlet for that. So Bridges to Prosperity is a very unique opportunity.
It is very unique in that sense. And with that in mind, I strongly encourage anybody listening to this pod to get involved with Bridges to Prosperity, to reach out directly to Avery or through us via LinkedIn, because you can imagine each of your organisations has plenty of opportunities and work to do, and Bridges to Prosperity are hungry for that support.
So that's it for today. For our listeners, we hope you'll share this podcast with colleagues and anyone you think may be interested, and leave us your reviews on iTunes or Spotify. But for now, thank you, Adrian, for hosting with me as always, and Avery for being a guest on the show.
Thanks, Ilya. Inside Infrastructure is an Infrastructure Partnerships Australia podcast sponsored by PwC Australia, hosted by Adrian Dwyer and Ilya Zak. The show is produced by TAG, PwC Australia's media agency. This episode was produced by Adam Stevens, with research for the episode done by Yosra Alawadi, Linda Bergerson, and Mitch Dudley. You can subscribe to future episodes of the show on iTunes, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts.